Hello, Honors 100 students. Welcome to another week of class. From my perspective, things went really well for our first week online. Appreciated people keeping up on the reading response journals as well as participating in the online discussion threads. Overwhelmingly, I think folks are doing really nicely with that. I will plan to check in with those folks who I haven't really heard from yet, starting probably on Wednesday of this week. So if you don't hear from me, especially by the end of this week in regards to your participation in the online class, rest assured that no news is good news in that regard, right? So if I'm not kind of reaching out to you individually, it probably means you're just doing what you're kind of meant to do in this setting. And if you are not kind of meeting my expectations, again, this is kind of a checkpoint where I'll let you know if that is the case at that point. I also wanted to say, I think I may have mentioned this in one of my first couple videos, but when I'm liking posts in the discussion thread, that's usually meant mostly as an acknowledgement that I saw it. So some of the comments, obviously, I'm responding to in a more explicit way. And so obviously in those cases, I have read it and kind of engaged with it. In some cases, it might be that either I think you've already just kind of said it really nicely and there's not much that I have to add, or I want to leave room for others to engage with the discussion before I weigh in. So if I don't comment, that doesn't mean it's a poor comment at all on your part, but the like kind of just signifies that I have read it and kind of acknowledged it, and I'm giving you credit for having participated in the discussion. So again, just as a reminder, please make sure you're participating at least once with at least one substantive comment per each of these discussion threads, and that's kind of meeting your obligation in terms of engagement and participation as the class goes on in this online format. The annotated bibliography assignment, of course, is due Tuesday, March 31st. If all goes as planned, this video is going up on Monday, but for Tuesday's class, kind of so to speak. So nonetheless, Tuesday, I'm going to basically accept those assignments without any late penalty until 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, March 31st, to give you some extra time for those of you who might have other responsibilities, such as taking care of a younger sibling or taking care of an older relative, or things along the lines of just not having kind of regular access to the internet and need to kind of hustle to get over to a coffee shop with wireless or something like that. So whatever the format might be for you, I'm trying to give you some extra kind of leeway and a grace period for getting that in. That said, I have seen them already from a small handful of students, so thank you so much for working ahead on this assignment. By and large, really good work, and I'll plan to get your feedback to you soon. Similar to with the essays, I plan to grade these on a rolling basis, so some of you will probably have feedback as soon as Wednesday morning for this assignment. For some of you, it might be a few days after that, just kind of in the order that I get to them, but rest assured, I will work my way through all of them, and I expect certainly within a week, I should be able to have your feedback and scores to you. But okay, so carrying on for today's class, we were reading the first half of the Alice Munro piece, The Bear Came Over the Mountain. So with this, obviously it's a relatively long read, so there's more than we can address kind of point by point everything in it. I'm going to hit a few of the highlights from my perspective. Again, in the discussion thread, please feel free to respond to the questions I'm posing in or the very specific passages I'm kind of alluding to, but also feel free to broaden out the discussion and talk about other pieces that were of interest to you, and we'll kind of tackle all of that in the thread there. But okay, so I wanted to start with just the way that this piece starts. It sort of has a zeroing in effect by starting with Fiona and Grant when they're young and then moving on to the more present action of the story. And I'm curious of how people read that, right? Because I can certainly understand one response to be that it's sort of confusing, sort of disorienting. And to give some context, Alice Munro is probably one of the most accomplished short story writers and novella writers of her generation. So I don't think there's very much done here by mistake or that it's poor craft. I would suggest that if you found the beginning a little bit confusing, a little disorienting, that's largely her intention. So why we think that she would do that, and also just what she's doing in terms of content of what's happening here. I think there's a surface level, very obvious function that this section is serving at the very beginning of the story, but also some more kind of subversive things happening in terms of the form she's choosing to deliver it in. The next spot I want to go to is on page 279. There's this note that Grant avoided thinking about all that female apparatus, is the verbiage that's used. And I was curious what we think that tells us about Grant in terms of kind of the way that he thinks, the way that he sees things, what he kind of engages with intellectually. I think there's deceptively a good bit packed into that verbiage of him saying, yeah, he avoided thinking about all that female apparatus. Then going on to page 281, kind of the top half of the page before the section break, there's this exchange between Grant and the woman who's working at this facility, where they're talking about the second floor, and it kind of has sort of these almost ominous kind of connotations to it of this being where people go when they're further along in kind of their deterioration and kind of health or mental state. And there's this kind of back and forth about how it doesn't apply to Grant's wife at this point in the story, but I would suggest a little bit of an implication that it will eventually, right? And kind of what we make of that exchange and the way that each person kind of approaches that conversation. On page 282, we look at the last full paragraph or so on that page. There's some verbiage around calling the people inmates here, right? There's a little bit of commentary on television. And I'm just curious kind of what people make of that word choice, of how television is kind of discussed here and elsewhere in this passage that we have so far from this story. Moving along with the story, when we get towards 286 and some of the surrounding pages, a little before and a little after, we get some information about Grant's kind of history in interacting with women outside of his marriage, and particularly it's alluding to students he was working with. And I think it's a really interesting kind of portrayal of this character here. Because I'll say, at least from my perspective, I'm not that sympathetic to Grant. He kind of comes across as a little blundering here, but also a little bit kind of not taking responsibility for something that seems pretty wrong that he was doing in terms of whether you want to consider it infidelity, whether you want to consider it potentially sexual harassment, whether you want to consider it kind of coercion or kind of taking advantage of people who are in a less kind of powerful state than him relative to his role as a professor at that point, and kind of what we make of it. Because I'm just giving you hints as to my perspective on this character, but I think you might have your own perspectives that you had either in a first read through or just as I'm raising these questions as you look over again page 286 and some of the surrounding content again, what we think of him. Especially in this era of the Me Too movement, right, which was a big thing, in the last couple of years, where women kind of come forward with these cases where, they were sort of, mistreated or taken advantage of or put in uncomfortable situations. What sense we make of Grant's broader situation and kind of his level of responsibility here. And you might want to defend him, and I'm certainly open to that perspective as well. I think there's an extent to which we could. So feel free to kind of weigh in on either part of that discussion. But then as we go on here, from page 290 to 292, we start to see some changes in Fiona's behavior, right? Where she's sort of behaving in, I would just sort of strange ways in what she talks about. It doesn't quite all add up, or there's some inconsistencies between what she's saying and what Grant is hearing elsewhere. And there's this focus on Aubrey, right? There's this other man who's in the facility with her. And I'm just curious what people kind of make of Fiona's relationship with Aubrey. Excuse me. If we sort of chalk it up to the two of them just being friends, if we think Grant is being jealous or if he's justified in that jealousy. And I guess to some extent this broader question of does it matter, right? Is she kind of on to a new life, and does Grant just kind of have to accept that if she's going to be living in this facility that they're no longer married, at least in the sense that they were when they were both living in the same house together. I think that it raises some interesting questions about these things, and in some ways some complicated answers that we might have here. I don't know if we all necessarily agree in what we make of this. And there's also the possibility here that we could read into this, that some of this could be Fiona kind of consciously messing with Grant, right? I think if we read this story on a surface level, and I think it's reasonable too, she just sort of is losing her mind and kind of getting used to her life and with hanging out with Aubrey and all these pieces. But I think another way we could interpret this is that for all of the kind of philandering, for lack of a better word, that Grant did for seeing other women and kind of taking advantage of these situations and kind of of putting the family in an uncomfortable position. Could it be that Fiona is kind of striking back in her own way now that she has the ability to? I'm not entirely sure that I think that is the case, but I think it's something that is certainly possible and that we could read into. So I'd be interested to hear if any students had ideas along those lines. But carrying on here, let's see, on page 297, there's this reference to Saturdays that Monroe describes as having a holiday bustle and tension. And she kind of gives some characterizations of mothers and fathers and children and how they interact with each other and the different roles they occupy within a family and how they interact with the people they're visiting. And I'm curious what people made of these characterizations of different people in a family. I'm sure many of you fill one of these roles or another, or maybe multiple roles within your own family, and kind of how that kind of speaks to you, if this all seems like familiar family dynamics or kind of very specific and nuanced to the situation that Monroe is describing. Again, I think that's open to interpretation. I can sort of see it in a variety of different ways, but I am interested in hearing what all of you think. So but I'm going to leave it there for the Monroe. So this is more or less the first half of this piece. We're going to read the second half of it for next time. So I think it's interesting. I'm not driving at a very specific agenda with this piece. More so, I think it's just sort of an interesting piece of literature, and I wanted to read something a little bit longer form that we could kind of digest over a couple of class periods. So really interested to hear student perspective here. If you have read ahead, please be careful to restrict kind of your responses to this first half of the reading, so we're not going to spoil anything for other students. Rest assured, the next online class session, we will focus on the second half of the reading and give a chance to respond to that, as well as respond to the piece more on the whole. And one of the questions that I'm going to allude to in our next class session is the name of this story and why we think Monroe called it that, what relevance that has, what that might tell us. So if that's somewhere that you were already thinking, hold those thoughts for next time. Rest assured, we will get there in our next class. All right, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you next time.